Good afternoon and welcome to History Bites. My name is Julia Ashworth and I am Gunston Hall's Civic Engagement Educator and the moderator for our August program. This month we're featuring Kathryn Gehred, who will introduce our Women and Politics mini-series. Her talk will highlight the perceived role of women in the 18th century and the rights that these women had, according to prominent rights documents of the time. Kathryn Gehred is a women's historian specializing in early American women's history. She co-edited the Papers of Martha Washington, a publication of the Washington Papers Project at the University of Virginia. Currently, she serves as the media editor with Encyclopedia Virginia and hosts the podcast Your Most Obedient and Humble Servant, which showcases letters by 18th and early 19th century women. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, Kathryn.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
All right. So while Kathryn pulls up her presentation, I want to speak to our viewers. Viewers, if you have questions at any time during our program here today, please do drop them into the chat here in YouTube Live or email us at Gunston Hall's email. That is historic@gunstonhall.org. And I'll share these questions a little bit further along in our program today. All right. Feel free to take it away, Kathryn.
Thank you so much. All right, share my screen. Okay, so I decided when I was invited to come talk that for Gunston Hall, which is an excellent museum that you should all go visit very soon, that I was going to try to talk about Virginia women and George Mason's concept of rights. So I did a quick little introductory slide about me. I was an editor on the Papers of Martha Washington, which is a volume of all of Martha Washington's correspondence. And from my work working in documentary editing, that inspired me to make the podcast, Your Most Obedient and Humble Servant, where I take 18th and early 19th century women's letters that are on interesting subjects and try to feature each letter individually. Currently, I work for Encyclopedia Virginia, which is where I got some of the content that I'm going to be talking about today. And I thought that considering that this is the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, there's been a lot of discussion about rights and rights talk. I am very interested in how Virginia women and 18th century women included themselves in this concept of natural rights, the type of rights that George Mason was so enthusiastic about. So, to talk about that, first of all, you have to sort of get an introduction of what George Mason's concept of liberty and natural rights actually were. And you would think that this would be fairly simple, considering that he was the author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, where he's literally declaring what rights he believes that everyone should have. But still, somehow, historians disagree on exactly what George Mason meant when he talked about natural rights. So just know that everything I'm giving you is an overview. There are people who might take something slightly differently. But in general, when Virginians like George Mason and Thomas Jefferson and people were trying to come up with their idea of what natural rights were relevant for the new government. They were doing it at a very specific time when the colonies were trying to become independent from Great Britain. So a lot of the language that they use is a legal argument. There's a recent book by Stephen Sarson called The Course of Human Events that talks about basically how the Declaration of Independence was a legal argument saying why it was sort of legal move for the colonists to declare independence from Great Britain. So when they're talking about something like all men being created equal, it means something in a very specific context. And basically, and I think this lines up with George Mason's concept of natural rights, the idea is that while all men were born in the natural world with certain inalienable natural rights, they give up some of those rights in order to enter a state of society. So government exists as this society that is meant to protect the weak from the sort of natural injustices of the weak versus the strong in the natural world. So, in order to take advantage of these government protected rights, you have to join into that government system. And in order to do that, you have to be a man with property of who is not enslaved. So while there's all this language of all men being created equal, the actual text of the documents make it pretty clear that that's kind of a limited definition of men. And this lines up a lot with John Locke's philosophies of natural rights and philosophy at the time, that government exists as a contract between the government, the leaders, and the people. And if the government is not doing its job of protecting the people's rights, then the people are able to declare independence and become free. Um, so there is historical debate about how exactly influential Locke was specifically on this concept, but it's pretty clear in George Mason's writings and a lot of the writings of the time that this is kind of the concept, the social contract idea of natural rights, is why it's okay for the United States or the colonies to declare independence from Great Britain, because King George has not been holding up his side of the bargain. He is not protecting the rights of the people, and therefore the people get to create their own government. And George Mason, being an excellent writer and an excellent theorist, is able to articulate these rights in a way that not a lot of other people at the time were able to. And he makes a great influence, or a great example of the government exists to protect the rights of the weak from the strong. And a government might say that it is protecting your rights if it's taking your rights away, but it is not. It is simply tyranny. And also, George Mason was an advocate for the separation of the public sphere versus the private sphere. And this is something that comes out of sort of 17th century England politics, of the split between the court, which is the king's court, and the country, which is the landed property gentlemen represented to parliament. And should the power be in parliament or with the king? And George Mason and the people on his side of the constitutional debates are very much on the side of country. They're very much on the side of the people. So that's kind of an idea, an introduction to his concept of natural rights. I also wanted to look into what George Mason wrote about women. And there's not a whole lot. I know there's been several house fires in the history of Gunston Hall, so some of his family writings don't exist in a way that I would have liked. But it seems pretty clear from what does exist that he considers women to be part of that private sphere. They're separate from the political sphere of government. Women exist in the household, in the home, and they should remain separate from that political sphere. One of the quotes I was able to pull about from George Mason writing about women is actually his really beautiful eulogy that he wrote for his wife, Anne Eilbach Mason. Um, I've read a lot of eulogies or writings from men whose wives died in this time, and normally they're a lot shorter and less eloquent than George Mason, so I was actually very impressed by it. But if you look at his quote, he says, "Her modest virtues shunned the public eye, superior to the turbulent passions of pride and envy, a stranger to altercation of every kind, and content with the blessings of a private station. She placed all her happiness here, where only it is to be found, in her own family." So he's again emphasizing what he considers to be a good virtue of a woman, as emphasized in his wife, is the focus on the family, shunning the public sphere, focusing on her private station. And then in another letter, he's writing about another woman, and he mentions that women have natural weakness and incapacity, which is fairly standard feelings of 18th century sort of gender roles at the time, is the women are the natural weaker sex, and they need to be protected by men. And this comes into play again in the language of rights when you're talking about why women are not included amongst the rights of all men who are by nature born equally free. So George Mason, in his remarks on annual elections for the Fairfax Independent Company, writes that all men are by nature born equally free and independent. And women, in George Mason's and a lot of men of the time's view, were necessarily dependent on someone. They're dependent on their husband, they're dependent on their father, they're dependent on some other man. And so therefore they can't be this free, independent land-holding person because they are always necessarily dependent on somebody else. And that's why even when they use this broad language of all men being created equal, they really do mean men and are not including women in that concept of rights. Now, while George Mason doesn't have a lot of writing about women, John Locke does. And again, there's a lot of debate right now about how influential John Locke's two treatises of government actually were when it comes to the American government. But there's enough similarities in his view of natural rights to the government that we ended up with that I think it's still worth talking about. And John Locke writes sort of accidentally quite a bit about women because his two treatises on government from 1690 were written in direct response to a book called Patriarcha by Robert Filmer, which was making the argument that the king is the patriarch of England. It's not, the government is not a social contract. The government is very much power at the top, and then everyone else is at the bottom, similar to the way a family is structured, with the father at the head of the family and the rest of the family subservient to him. And this is the natural state, according to Robert Filmer. And John Locke disagrees with this completely. He writes quite a bit trying to argue against this concept of the king holding all the power. John Locke believes that the king only should have enough power as to protect the people's rights, and if he's not, then the people have the right to reject their government. And one of the ways that he talks about this is by describing why the family isn't actually a perfect patriarchy in the way that Robert Filmer describes it. He says that while the man is, of course, the head of the household, John Locke admits, he says men are the abler and the stronger, which means that necessarily they hold the power in a marriage. But he does say that women are also rational creatures, and that women are able to enter into contracts and legal contracts and have some legal rights because they are rational sort of co-leaders of the family, which he's mostly just saying just specifically against Robert Filmer, but it has little interesting implications. And also he's writing as somebody who is part of Great Britain that has just recently had many queens. So if you're saying that women can't take part in government, then how on earth do you justify that you're from a country that has queens? So he's saying he's acknowledging the reality that in real life, women do sometimes control property and take part in government, even in, the 1600s. That women are capable of entering a contract, particularly the marriage contract, which they choose to enter and that they can actually leave. Now, an ungenerous but reasonable reading of John Locke's take on women and property is that women have rights only so far as they are protecting men's rights to property. Women exist as a way to funnel men's property to their heirs through things like a will. So if a man has a lot of land that he wants to make sure that his son gets, he can save that property to his wife, and his wife can take care of it until it goes on to his heirs. And that's kind of the sort of traditional legal reading of women's political role at this time. He's not saying that women are national creatures is not, or rational creatures is not necessarily, John Locke saying go feminism or whatever. So with all of this talk of how narrow somebody like George Mason was thinking when he wrote something like all men are created equal, he's only talking about men of property, men who have chosen to enter this contract of government. It can start to feel a little bit like the rights really are, the government was written to limit rights rather than grant rights to people. But I do think it's important to look at what people were actually saying at the time and the actual words that they use, because they use really sweeping, dramatic language when they're talking about natural rights. George Mason's first draft of the Virginia Declaration of Independence, or the Virginia Declaration of Rights, excuse me, says once again, all men are born equally free and independent and have certain inherent natural rights. Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. James Wilson writes, all power was originally in the people. And he doesn't even say men, he says people in general, and that all powers of government are derived from them. And I was able to find an article while researching for this where historian David Little points out that the Virginia Declaration of Rights is the closest of all of these American Revolutionary documents to the eventual 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's language that is actually granting more rights to more people. And this was something threatening. While there's a limit to what they were imagining for those rights, it is still an expansion of rights to people who may not have had as much power under the traditional king at the top, everyone else serves the king concept of government. And how do I know that this was threatening? Because people got nervous about it. John Adams wrote to James Sullivan shortly after Abigail Adams had written her famous Remember the ladies letter. John Adams responds to Abigail sort of dismissively and jokingly, but then he writes to James Sullivan. He says, "It is certain in theory that the only moral foundation of government is the consent of the people. Certain in theory. But to what extent shall we carry this principle? Whence arises the right of men to govern women without their consent?" So he's thinking of these questions of, okay, if we're going to say that the government is only the government because they consent to be governed, why do men get to govern women then? He's aware that women are rational creatures that might disagree with these things. And he's not saying that they shouldn't, that men shouldn't govern women, but he's saying that if we're going to make this argument, we need to be able to back it up. And then I love this quote. This is from Thomas Ledwell Lee to Richard Henry Lee while they're debating in the Virginia House of Delegates the Virginia Declaration of Rights. He says, "I will tell you plainly that a certain set of aristocrats, for we have such monsters here, finding that their execrable system cannot be reared on such foundations, have to this time kept us at bay on the first line, which declares all men to be born equally free and independent." So the property holders in Virginia are seeing this language, all men are born equally free and independent, and they're thinking, this is going to have repercussions for the people we enslave. This is going to have repercussions for people who don't own property, who are poor and want to be able to get the vote. And they're trying to stop that. And certain people, like Thomas Ledwell Lee and Richard Henry Lee, are saying, so what? Maybe more people get more rights. That's not a bad thing. So now we're going to get into specific language that's used by specific Virginia women all around this time where all of the halls of government are talking about rights and slavery and liberty and property and who deserves what, and seeing how women were able to use this language to describe their own situations. So Hannah Lee Corbin is a member of the prominent Lee family. We literally just read a quote from Richard Henry Lee and Thomas Ledwell Lee, and they're a fairly radical, well-educated family in Virginia. And she was a widow. Her husband, Gawain Corbin, had died in the winter of 1759 to 1760, and his will stated that she would lose the plantation if she remarried. So she is, as a widow, managing the plantation that she married into, Peckatone, very profitably. She actually converted to be a Baptist and basically remarried the Baptist Richard Lincoln Hall, but she never legally married him because as Baptists, that marriage wouldn't be recognized by the Anglican Church. And again, legally, if she remarried, she might lose control of the plantation. It was going to be a legal sort of quagmire. So she basically is living unmarried with a man as though they are married for 20 years, managing this plantation. And we have a letter. Unfortunately, her letter has been lost, but there's a letter from Richard Henry Lee to Hannah Lee Corbin from March 17th, 1778. So we're in the thick of the American Revolution at this point. And he writes, "You complain that widows are not represented, and that being temporary possessors of their estates ought not to be liable to the tax. The doctrine of representation is a large subject, and it is certain that it ought to be extended as far as wisdom and policy can allow. Nor do I see that either of these forbid widows having property from voting, notwithstanding it has never been in practice here or in England. Perhaps 'twas thought rather out of character for women to press into those tumultuous assemblies of men where the business of choosing representatives was conducted." So it's clear from the content of this letter that she has written to him saying, hey, if I'm not being represented, if I can't vote and choose a delegate to represent me in Congress, then I shouldn't have to pay taxes. You say no taxation without representation. Well, what about me as a widow? I can't vote and I'm not married. And he is a little bit, he's trying to say, well, we don't forbid it, but it's never been done before, as though anything else that is happening here has been done before. And he falls back on that old argument that George Mason and John Locke agreed with, that it's out of character for women to be participating in government. Women don't belong in that public sphere. They belong in the private sphere. And the private sphere is important. These men would all argue that the private sphere is one of the things that they're fighting for these rights to keep separate from government. But women don't belong in this public sphere. And what Hannah Lee Corbin is basically saying is, whether you think I belong here or not, I'm here, I'm a widow, I'm paying taxes, I do am affected by this government, and I think I should have a say in it. And this brings back a legal problem that has been bothering Virginians since the 1600s, which is the problem of wealthy widows. The life expectancy was short in Virginia for a very long time. And so a lot of times a woman would marry into this wealthy gentry class and then her husband would die. And now she has control of land, houses, property, huge numbers of enslaved people in many cases, and no man to manage the property. And so these widows have the legal category of femme sole. And this goes back to English law, English common law. Something that just it happens in the course of life is sometimes people die and sometimes widows, despite being the gentle sex that shouldn't be in charge of anything, have own property. Essentially, they control property and they pay taxes, but they're not represented. They can't vote. And in some cases, some of these women, somebody like Hannah Lee Corbin, is very well educated. She was educated with her brothers. Fits almost every argument for why somebody should be able to vote and have a say in their government, particularly in this new American, more equal government. They're basically free men in every sense, but the fact that they're not men. And legally, they have certain rights as a femsole, but that doesn't necessarily translate into being able to vote or get representation. The pictures that I chose for this slide, that is a young Martha Washington and John Mercer, who was the man who actually raised George Mason. John Mercer was an influential Virginia lawyer, and he was Martha Washington's lawyer before she was Martha Washington, when she was briefly an incredibly wealthy widow who was managing business between New Kent County and London. She would go through John Mercer. And so there was just a little connection that I wanted to tie in there. But this was not something that was uncommon. Femsols happened all of the time just because that's what life was like in Virginia at the time. So this brings me to my second example of a woman using this language of rights talk and liberty. This is Mary Willing Byrd. And I like her as an example because somebody like Hannah Lee Corbin is a little bit radical. She was a Baptist at a time where it was a little bit radical to be a Baptist. But Mary Willing Byrd was more conservative. An argument could be made that she was a loyalist. She denies being a loyalist for obvious reasons later, but she tends to be more conservative on things. But she still takes this language of natural rights, human rights, liberty, and uses them to her own advantage. So she was actually from Philadelphia. She's connected to the Willing and Shippen families. Her cousin, Peggy Shippen, you might recognize that name because she married Benedict Arnold. She married William Byrd III in 1761 and moved to Westover Plantation in Virginia, one of the largest slaveholding, powerful gentry families in Virginia. She gave birth to 10 children, 8 of whom survived to adulthood. And her husband, William Byrd III, was more of a loyalist. He remained a loyalist up until Governor Dunmore of Virginia wrote the Dunmore Proclamation, which promised liberty to enslaved people who joined the British. So that was a step too far for William Byrd III, and he tries to change tracks. He says, no, I'm on the Patriot side. But at that point, he had burned too many bridges. Nobody trusted him. He's in a huge amount of debt in Westover, and he eventually commits suicide in 1777. So all of a sudden, Mary Willing Byrd goes from being married into the prominent Byrd family to being one of these femme soles, these wealthy widows in charge of a massive plantation Westover. But this happens during the American Revolution when the economy is in shambles. Her situation is incredibly precarious, and she sees that very early on. And she has a very difficult war. Her house is occupied by the British twice, not just once, but twice. And she also was raided by the Patriots, because remember, her husband had been a loyalist. And after Benedict Arnold, married to her cousin, comes and takes over Westover and starts taking her property for the British war effort, she's accused of being a spy or a turncoat. And the Patriot forces come and raid her house with her family, her young family, in the middle of the night and go through her papers and threaten her with drawn swords. And she is furious about this. And the Virginian government takes a lot of her property, a lot of her horses, and enslaved people, always including enslaved people in what her concept is of property, um, for the Patriot War effort. So she's having property taken from her from both sides. She's aware that she's hugely in debt and is in a very financially precarious situation. And she does what she can to advocate for herself, which is writing letters. And she uses the language, the revolutionary language of the time, to make her arguments. So this is Mary Willing Bird on property. She points out the British destroy my property, for which I am condemned by my countrymen. She says my property is taken from me and I have no redress. Now, George Mason was a huge advocate for the government existing to protect the property of the individual. The government shouldn't be taking your property because it exists to help you protect your property. And she's pointing out that she has had her property taken from her and she has no form of redress other than just begging for help. And Most of my information about Mary Willing Bird is from Amy Flugrad-Jackish's, apologies for my pronunciation of that name, her article, What Am I But an American, about Mary Willing Bird. But she points out that in 1782, Mary Willing Bird put forth no fewer than 22 public claims and certificates trying to get some of her property back that had been taken from her during this war. She is furious that the government, which is supposed to be advocating for liberty and independence, is taking what she owns from her and not giving it back. She doesn't end up getting anything back, by the way, or any of the enslaved people who joined the British. Almost, she doesn't get any of that property back. She also writes about taxation. She says, I have paid taxes during a tedious war and now am not protected by my countrymen. And then I have paid my taxes and have not been personally or virtually represented. This, I believe, is key because I mentioned earlier how women are supposed to be represented by their husbands. They're dependent on their husbands. So if their husband votes and their husband gets represented in Congress, then that counts as the woman being represented. And she's saying, no, I am not personally represented or virtually represented because I don't have a husband and I still have to pay these taxes. And then she also writes about using the language of liberty when she describes when Patriot forces stormed her house in the middle of the night. This is her quote. When I speak of the indecent actions of these people, I only mean such as I have already mentioned, of coming into my bedchamber and flourishing drawn swords on defenseless people. They begged me not to be uneasy. I assured them my uneasiness was for them. I was sorry to see my countrymen act a part they must blush at. What a contemptible figure did they make. So here she is doing her part of staying in the private sphere, managing her household and her family. She's in bed with her children, and the government, the military comes into her home with swords drawn, dragging her out of her space. She writes, this surely cannot be styled liberty. It was liberty that savages would have blushed at. Now, the language she uses there, she says savages, that is actually a slur for indigenous people. But again, the fact that she uses this language is reflecting the fact that she's paying attention to the conversations going on. Thomas Jefferson talks about indigenous people quite a bit. He uses the same term. But the idea of everyone in a state of nature having certain natural rights, what somebody like John Locke was talking about in that, and is indigenous people, indigenous groups in America exist in their imagination as being something closer to a state of nature. They don't have this concept of government rights and liberty because the indigenous people in their imagination exist in this sort of natural, wild state of liberty, which is all imaginary, all theoretical, doesn't reflect the way indigenous groups actually lived at all. But by her saying this group, this was liberty that savages would have blushed at, she's saying that even compared to those indigenous groups, you have behaved in a way that affects my liberty. And George Mason agrees with Mary Bird on this. The letters that she's writing to Thomas Nelson line up nicely with George Mason's petition of the freeholders and other inhabitants of the counties of Prince William and Fairfax. This is a petition that was written by George Mason in December of 1781. So this is very shortly after Yorktown. He wrote a scathing petition against Governor Nelson for the way that Thomas Nelson went to wealthy Virginians' homes and took their property in order to aid the war effort. He said the above mentioned orders for seizures, instead of being confided to men of approved probity and discretion in the different counties, have been executed by military sergeants and common soldiers who have insulted and abused the inhabitants. He says, your petitioners conceive that the enormity and tyranny of these proceedings can hardly be paralleled in the most despotic governments. So this lines up very nicely with how Mary Bird is arguing about how the seizure of her property is impinging on her rights. And George Mason, who helped write the Virginia Declaration of Rights and write the new Virginia government, the Constitution, he's aware that yes, his government did not allow for these types of rights to be impinged upon, and he's furious about it. But while this petition was very influential at the time that it was submitted, and Thomas Nelson steps down shortly afterwards, it's also considered a bad political move for George Mason at the time because there's a war going on. So certain people are saying, well, if we're not going to give up our property to the government in order to win a war, then really when can we? It seems like he's sort of overstepping a bit. But that's one of the things that I like about George Mason is he is not willing to compromise on his beliefs about rights, even if it hurts him politically. And that's exactly what he's doing here. So I just think it's interesting that George Mason and Mary Willingbird were both furious at Governor Nelson for the way that he seized property. And now, before finishing up the section, I do want to mention we've been talking a lot about property and rights and all of this natural rights talk. For somebody like Mary Willingbird, who is a very wealthy woman who controls a huge amount of property, including enslaved people, she's able to see herself in this system, fitting into this system, and then still seeing sort of glaring inadequacies in the amount of rights she receives. But to be a person who is enslaved, who is also hearing all of this language of liberty and slavery and freedom and independence and just being wholly excluded from the concept of it while you are living this enslaved experience where you can see just exactly all that has been taken away from you. I think it must have been absolutely maddening to be an enslaved person at this time listening to all of this language. And so I want to mention that there were other Virginia women who were also advocating for their rights in different ways. The picture that I have here is from a list of enslaved people who had joined the British following Dunmore's proclamation. And that woman in the middle, Deborah Squash, who was married to Harry Squash, she was a woman enslaved by George Washington at Mount Vernon. And when the British came up the river and offered her freedom, in if she was willing to leave George Washington's plantation, she went and sought for her liberty in that way. She voted with her feet. She joined the British and she left. Now, a lot of those people who joined the British did end up dying of illness and other issues. But what they were doing was, with this, given the choice of the American independence and rights that were going to keep you enslaved, and Great Britain, who are offering you actual, visceral, real freedom for joining them, she chased her own freedom and liberty in the way that she chose by joining the British. So it was a completely different war from her perspective, but she also was understanding the concept of liberty in a different way. So my conclusion is that while Virginia women were not consciously included in George Mason's concept of natural rights, they were still able to use the revolutionary language of the time to advocate for themselves and argue for their own rights, even if they weren't necessarily included in those actual documents in the way that the men writing them imagined them. So, uh, thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Kathryn. That was such an amazing talk. And I really, really appreciated the way that you spoke to not just the wealthy women and their concepts of property, but then also what these rights looked like for women who were enslaved here in Virginia and in the colonies themselves. Thank you so much again for your talk, and thank you so much to our viewers for joining us for the first bites, the first bite in our Women and Politics mini-series. Join us next month for a continuation of this mini-series with an exciting talk with Dr. Kathryn Turk from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill on Wednesday, September 16th. We hope to see you then, and as always, stay hungry. Amazing.